They killed my grandmother on a Tuesday in a market with a single shot, and they were so proud of how clean it was. No collateral. No witnesses they cared about. One old woman, dead on the warm stones of a market square, and the soldier who did it actually smiled because he thought he'd done something small. I was there. I have to tell you that because I don't want you to think I'm reconstructing this from records. I was 20 paces away, holding a bag of the spiced fruit she liked, the kind she could never resist when we passed that particular stall, and I watched my grandmother die. I watched a Tellurian soldier in the light armor of the Imperium step out of the crowd as casually as if he were going to ask her the time, and raise a sidearm, and fire once, and I watched her go down on the warm market stones with a small surprised sound, and I watched the soldier lower his weapon and look around at the silent, stunned crowd with an expression I will never forget as long as I live. He looked proud. He looked like a man who has done a difficult job well. He had no fear in him at all, because the Imperium had told him what they'd told themselves, that he was killing one weak old woman, one small obstacle, and that nothing would come of it but the freedom his empire deserved. He holstered his weapon and he walked away. Nobody stopped him. The whole market stood frozen, every species in it, dozens of beings who had lived their entire lives in the long silence and had no idea, none of them, what they had just witnessed. They thought they'd seen a murder, a terrible thing, a crime, but a small one in the scale of a galaxy, one death. I knew better, even in that first moment, even with my grandmother's blood spreading across the stones and the bag of spiced fruit falling from my hands, because I'd been raised in her house. I'd grown up among the tired people who held the peace, and I understood, kneeling beside her, pressing my hands uselessly against a wound that had already taken her, that the soldier hadn't killed a woman. He'd cut the single thread that 900 years of quiet hung from. I could almost feel it, in that frozen market, the great invisible structure of the Concordance, the thing my grandmother had carried in her body, coming loose from its anchor and beginning, silently, to fall. He had no idea. None of them did. They thought they'd killed a person. What they'd actually killed was 900 years of peace, and it took the galaxy about a week to understand that, and by then it was already too late to put back. My name is Niamh Adeyemi-Sorensen. My grandmother was Niamh Adeyemi-Sorensen, and if you've heard that name at all, you've heard it wrong, because the histories that exist now were written by frightened survivors trying to make sense of a thing they didn't understand while it was happening. So let me tell it the way it actually was. Let me tell you who she really was, and what she actually held together, and why one bullet in a market square unmade a peace older than most of the world's it kept quiet. I have to start with the Concordance, because my grandmother was the Concordance. In a way, I'm going to spend this whole telling trying to make you understand. 900 years before that Tuesday, this region of the galaxy had been a slaughterhouse. I mean that plainly. There were 11 major species sharing a cluster of stars too close together for comfort, and for thousands of years they had done what species too close together generally do, which is kill each other over everything and nothing: territory, old grievances, religion, resources, the simple animal terror of the neighbor who might strike first. It was called in the records the long screaming. Thousands of years of war so constant that whole species had forgotten there had ever been anything else. Children were born into it, grew old in it, died in it, and the only thing every one of those 11 species shared was the certainty that it would never end, because it never had. And then it ended, not because anyone won, not because of a weapon or a conquest or a great battle. It ended because of an idea, and the idea came from the newest and smallest people in the cluster, who'd arrived late and poor and been nearly exterminated 3 times in their first century, just for existing in a place everyone else was fighting over. The humans. I want to be careful here, because this is the part the histories puff up into something grander than it was, and the truth is better than the puffery. Humanity didn't bring peace because we were wise or noble or specially gifted. We brought peace because we were desperate and small and could not win, and so we had to think of something other than winning. Every other species in the cluster was strong enough to dream of victory. We weren't. We were the only people there who had truly, bone-deep accepted that we could not conquer our way to safety, and that acceptance, which the strong species sneered at as weakness, turned out to be the one thing none of them had, and the one thing the cluster needed. So a human, 900 years ago, a woman whose name is mostly lost, proposed the thing that became the concordance of the long silence. And the idea at the heart of it was strange, and it was this, that the peace would not be held by a treaty, because treaties are paper and paper burns. It would not be held by a balance of weapons, because balances tip. It would be held by a person. A single living person of the smallest and least threatening species who would carry the peace in their own body and their own authority, who would be, legally and spiritually, and in every way the 11 species could devise, the embodiment of the agreement itself. While the peace-bearer lived, the concordance held. Every species swore it. Every species bound itself to it. The peace was not a document. It was a heartbeat. They chose humans for the role for the same reason humanity had thought of it, because we were small, because we could not conquer, because a peace-bearer from any of the strong species would have been a threat, a king in disguise, but a peace-bearer from the little desperate humans was no one's master and no one's enemy. We were trusted precisely because we were not feared. The weakest people in the cluster became the keepers of its peace, generation after generation, for 900 years, and the long screaming became the long silence, and a galaxy that had known nothing but war learned slowly what quiet was. My grandmother was the 43rd peace-bearer, and I need you to understand what that job actually was, because it was not what it sounds like. It sounds like an honor, a ceremonial post, a figurehead, an old woman in robes who shows up at functions and embodies a nice idea. It was not that. It was the hardest job in the galaxy, and it nearly broke every person who ever held it, and it had broken parts of my grandmother that I didn't understand until I had to do it myself. Being the peace-bearer meant you spent your entire life holding 11 furious species back from each other's throats. The long screaming hadn't gone anywhere. The grievances hadn't healed. The hatreds were 900 years old and counting, banked down under the concordance but never extinguished, and every single day, somewhere in the cluster, some new spark threatened to catch. A border incident, an insult, an old massacre's anniversary, a trade dispute that woke an ancient rage. And every single day, the peace-bearer was the one who flew out to wherever the spark was and stood in the middle of it, and held the two sides apart with nothing but her body and her authority and her bottomless, exhausting, lifelong refusal to let it burn. My grandmother did that for 51 years. 51 years of flying to the worst places in the cluster, and standing between species that wanted to kill each other and somehow, by sheer force of will and patience and the moral weight of the concordance she carried in her own person, talking them down. Again and again and again. She was old before her time. She slept badly. She carried the names of everyone the peace had failed to save in the small places where it had briefly slipped, and there were such names, because no peace is perfect and a peace-bearer cannot be everywhere. But the great war, the long screaming, the cluster-wide slaughter that she held. For 51 years she held it, the way her 42 predecessors had held it, in her own tired human body. I went with her once. I was perhaps 14, and she decided it was time I saw what the job actually was, and so she took me along to a world called Hethron's Reach, where a Vothan freighter had strayed into Keleth space and been fired on, and two ancient enemies were 3 hours from a shooting war over a navigation error. I remember the room. 2 delegations on opposite sides, armored, armed, every being in it vibrating with a hatred 900 years deep, the air so thick with it I could barely breathe. And into that room walked my grandmother, one small old human in plain robes, with no guards and no weapons and no power but the concordance she carried, and I watched her do the thing I would spend the rest of my life trying to learn. She didn't lecture them. She didn't threaten because she had nothing to threaten with. She didn't even at first talk about the freighter. She sat down between the two delegations, in the most dangerous spot in the room, the exact place a stray shot from either side would find first, and she put herself there on purpose, because a body in the crossfire is the oldest peace offering there is. And then she started asking questions, quiet ones. She asked the Keleth commander about his crew, whether anyone had been hurt when they fired, whether he'd wanted to fire or felt he had to. She asked the Vothan captain about her route, her cargo, her family waiting at the end of it. She found in front of my 14-year-old eyes the frightened thing under each angry thing, exactly as she'd told me 100 times in the kitchen, and she sat with it, and she would not leave, and slowly, over 6 hours, the room stopped vibrating. The weapons went down. The war that was 3 hours away receded back into the 900-year quiet it had almost broken. Nobody died on Hethron's Reach that day. Nobody ever knew how close they'd come, except the two delegations and one old woman and her granddaughter in the corner, learning what peace costs. On the flight home she was gray with exhaustion, and she slept the whole way, and I watched her sleep and understood for the first time that she did that constantly. That somewhere in the cluster there was always another Hethron's Reach, and she was always the one flying toward it, and she had been doing it for decades and would do it until she died. I think that was the day I started being afraid for her. I just didn't know what shape the fear would finally take. The strong species never understood what she did. That's the thing. To them she was a small old human who showed up and somehow the fighting stopped, and they got so used to the fighting stopping that they forgot it was ever a thing that required stopping. 900 years of peace had made them stupid about peace, the way being healthy your whole life makes you stupid about your heart. They couldn't feel it working. They couldn't see the cost of it. They saw an old woman in plain robes, and they could not connect her, in their minds, to the absence of the war their ancestors had died in, because the war was so long gone that it had stopped feeling real. I should tell you what the cluster was actually like, so the peace doesn't sound abstract. 11 species, dozens of inhabited worlds, all packed into a knot of stars you could cross in days rather than the long, empty months that separate most civilizations. That closeness was the whole problem. Most species in the galaxy are protected from each other by sheer distance. You can hate your neighbor all you like when your neighbor is a year's travel away. But the cluster species lived on top of each other. Their borders touched. Their trade lanes crossed. A Vothan world and a Keleth world might share the same sky, two rival peoples looking up at each other's planets every night, remembering every wrong their grandfathers had done to each other. In a place like that, peace isn't the natural state that war interrupts. War is the natural state, and peace is the unnatural, effortful, constantly collapsing thing that someone has to hold up by hand, every single day forever. That was the Concordance, not a treaty filed away in an archive, a living, daily act of holding. There was an entire quiet infrastructure beneath the peace-bearer human staff, mostly, the descendants of the first peacemakers, who tracked every grievance and every anniversary and every trade dispute across the whole cluster, who could see a spark forming weeks before it caught and root my grandmother to it in time. I grew up among them. They were the most tired people I ever knew, and the most stubborn, and they did their work in total obscurity because the entire trick of the Concordance was that the peace had to look effortless. If the cluster ever saw how much desperate labor went into keeping it quiet, they might lose faith that it could be kept at all, and faith was half of what held it. So the humans worked in the dark and let the galaxy believe the peace was just the way things were now. We carried the unbearable weight and let everyone else forget there was a weight. I want you to know some of them, because they matter to what comes later. There was old Sodo, who'd been tracking the cluster's grievances for 40 years and could recite from memory the exact date and casualty count of every massacre in the long screaming, all of them, because you cannot prevent the next war if you have forgotten the last one. There was Bayer, a quiet man who handled the Vathan file, who'd spent so long studying that one furious species that he dreamed in their language. There was a woman named Kala who was younger, only a little older than me, who I think was being groomed the way I should have been groomed if anyone had imagined the peace-bearer would die in my lifetime. These were not soldiers. None of them had ever held a weapon. They were the opposite of soldiers. They were the people whose entire lives were devoted to making sure the soldiers never had a reason to fight. And they loved my grandmother, not as a symbol but as the woman who came home gray with exhaustion and still asked after their families. And when she died, they were the ones who understood, before anyone else in the galaxy, exactly what had just been broken. They were also, I would learn, the only thing left that might put it back together, but that's later. And one of those strong species was the Tellurian Imperium. I have to tell you about the Imperium, because they're the ones who killed her, and I want to be fair to them, even now, even after everything, because unfairness is how the next war starts, and I have spent my whole life since that Tuesday trying to make sure there isn't a next one. The Imperium was the youngest of the strong species, not as young as humanity, but young enough to be hungry. They'd risen fast in the last 2 centuries into a real power, and like all fast-rising powers, they were full of a certainty that the existing order was a cage built by their inferiors to hold them back. They looked at the Concordance, the 900-year peace, and they did not see a miracle. They saw a leash. And they looked at the peace-bearer, the old human who embodied it, and they did not see the keystone of a galaxy's survival. They saw a small obstacle, a single weak point. One old woman standing between the Tellurian Imperium and the freedom to finally, gloriously, take what they believed was theirs. Their reasoning was simple and stupid, and exactly the kind of reasoning that fast-rising powers always find irresistible. The peace is held by one person. Remove the person, remove the peace. And in the chaos that follows, while everyone else is reeling, the Imperium, strong, ready, prepared, will seize the cluster before anyone can organize against it. Kill one woman, inherit a galaxy. It was, on paper, a brilliant plan. It had only one flaw, and the flaw was that the Imperium, like all the strong species, had never understood what the peace actually was, or how it actually worked, or what would actually happen when the heartbeat stopped. I learned later, from the records and the testimony and the long bitter inquiries that came after, exactly how the Imperium had talked themselves into it, and it is worth telling you, because it is the same way the powerful always talk themselves into catastrophe. They were not insane. They were not even, by their own lights, evil. They had simply made a model of the world that left out the one thing that mattered, and then trusted the model. Their strategists had studied the Concordance for years, and they had understood its legal structure perfectly, that the peace was bound to the peace-bearer, that her death would dissolve the binding. What they had not understood, could not understand, was the labor. They saw the binding and missed the holding. They thought the peace-bearer was a kind of legal switch, and that the peace was a stable state that would simply continue, with the Imperium now in charge, once the switch was flipped to them. They did not understand that the peace was not a state. It was an act, a continuous, daily, exhausting act of one person flying toward every spark, finding the frightened thing under every angry thing, sitting with it until it cooled. They thought they were removing a ruler and inheriting her throne. They were removing the only person doing a job that nobody else in the cluster knew how to do, or wanted to do, or even understood was being done. And they were inheriting nothing, because the thing they wanted to inherit only existed as long as the labor continued, and the labor died with my grandmother in that market. A switch can be flipped to a new owner. A heartbeat cannot. You cannot inherit a heartbeat. You can only stop it. They thought killing the peace-bearer would end the peace and let them take over. What it actually did was end the peace and let everyone take over, all at once, each other. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I keep wanting to rush to the catastrophe, because the catastrophe is easier to talk about than the woman. Let me slow down. Let me tell you about my grandmother as I actually knew her, not the 43rd peace bearer, not the keystone of the Concordance, but Amma, who taught me to cook, who had a laugh like a door swinging open, who was so tired some nights she couldn't lift her own arms, and who never once, in 51 years, told a single species in that cluster how tired she was, because the peace bearer cannot be tired. The peace cannot be tired. If they had ever seen how heavy it was, they might have realized how easily it could be dropped. I grew up in her house because my own parents had died young. That's a thing the histories don't mention, that the great peace bearer raised her orphaned granddaughter herself, in the gaps between flying off to stop wars. And so I knew her in a way no one else alive did. I knew her hands, which were always cold, because she gave so much of her warmth away to the cluster that I think she had little left for her own body. I knew the way she'd come home from some terrible negotiation, some standoff where she'd spent 3 days talking 2 species back from slaughter, and she wouldn't speak for hours. She'd just sit in the kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, staring at nothing, putting herself back together. And then she'd notice me watching, and she'd smile, and the smile was real even when it was exhausted, and she'd say, "Come here, little keystone, help me make something." There's nothing in the universe that doesn't feel better after you've made something with your hands. She called me that, little keystone. I thought it was just a pet name. I thought a lot of things were just things back then. She taught me to cook the food of old Earth. Recipes carried 900 years across the dark, and she taught me while she talked, and the talking was the real lesson, though I didn't know it. She'd be showing me how to fold something, how to season something, and she'd say, almost to herself, "The Vathan delegate today, he wanted to talk about his honor, his wounded pride, but underneath it he was just frightened, Niamh. They're always just frightened underneath." Every species that ever picked up a weapon was frightened first. The whole job, the whole piece, it's just finding the frightened thing under the angry thing and sitting with it until it isn't so afraid. That's all it is. That's the great secret of the Concordance. It's not strength. It's patience with frightened people for 900 years without stopping. She'd laugh that door-swinging laugh. It's the most boring magic in the galaxy, and it's the only kind that lasts. I have to start with the Concordance, but I wanted you to have her first, the real her, before I make her into history. Because they made her into history with a single shot, and I have spent my life since trying to give her back her hands, her cold hands, her tired smile, the way she said little keystone. They killed a symbol. I lost a grandmother. Both things are true, and I will not let you have only the first. Let me tell you about the Tuesday, the market, the single clean shot, and the thing my grandmother said to me the night before she died, when she already knew somehow, the way she always knew when a spark was about to catch. The thing she made me promise, that I didn't understand until her blood was on the warm stones, and the whole galaxy started to scream again after 900 years of quiet. The night before, she was strange. I want to tell you about that night because I've turned it over 10,000 times since. She came to my room late, which she never did. She respected sleep, hers and everyone's, the way only a permanently exhausted person can. But that night she sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, and she took my hand in her cold hands, and she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "Niamh, if anything ever happens to me, I need you to promise me something. Not what you'll think. Promise me you won't try to avenge me. Promise me you'll try to hold it instead." I didn't understand. I was half asleep, and I said something like, "Hold what, grandmother?" And she said, "The peace. If they ever take me, the temptation will be enormous for our people, and for me too, if I'm honest, to make them pay, to let it burn and call it justice. And that is exactly the trap, little keystone. That is exactly what the breaking is for. Whoever breaks the peace will be counting on the rest of us to break it further, to choose revenge, because revenge is the war's way of finishing what one bullet starts. The only way to honor a peacemaker is to keep making peace, even over her body, especially over her body. Promise me." I thought she was just tired. I thought it was the melancholy that came over her some nights. I said, yes, grandmother, I promise. The way you promise things to someone you love to make them feel better, and I went back to sleep, and I didn't understand that she had just handed me her entire life's work and her dying wish in the same breath, the night before she walked into a market to die. She knew, I'm sure of it now, not the details. But she knew the spark was coming, the way she always knew, 51 years of knowing, and she knew this one was different, this one was aimed at her, and she went anyway. Because the peace-bearer goes toward the spark. That's the whole job. She'd been walking toward the thing that would kill her for 51 years, and on that Tuesday it finally walked toward her, and she met it the way she'd met every other spark in her life. By going to where it was, openly, with empty hands, because that is what peace looks like, and peace cannot hide and still be peace. Because the Imperium thought killing one woman would be easy, and they were right. That was the terrible part. It was easy. One old woman in a market is the easiest thing in the world to kill. It's keeping her alive that was hard. It's what she did that was hard. And they never knew the difference until the silence ended and they heard, for the first time in 9 centuries, what their grandfather's war had actually sounded like. The silence didn't end all at once. That's the thing people get wrong. They imagine the peace shattering like glass, one clean break, the whole cluster bursting into war the moment my grandmother's heart stopped. It wasn't like that. It was slower and more horrible than that. It was like watching a great dam develop its first crack, and then watching the water find that crack, and then watching the crack widen, hour by hour, while everyone stood around arguing about whether the dam was really failing. The first day, nothing happened. That was almost the worst part looking back. My grandmother lay dead in a market, and I sat in the Concordance house with Soto and Bayer and Calla and the rest of the tired people, and we waited for the sky to fall, and it didn't, not that first day. The cluster didn't even know yet. News travels, but understanding travels slower, and most of the 11 species had no idea that the small old human who died on some market world was anything more than a sad little crime. But our people knew, and I will never forget the faces in that house the first night. These were the beings who tracked every grievance in the cluster, who could see the shape of the whole 900-year structure better than anyone alive. And they sat in that house and watched their instruments, and they were terrified, because they could see what was coming and they could not stop it. Old Soto had a great map of the cluster, the kind of thing he'd maintained for 40 years, every world and every border and every banked grievance marked on it, and he stood in front of that map all night, watching, and around the 3rd hour he said, very quietly to no one, "It's starting. Look, the Vathan are massing on the Keleth border." They felt it. They don't know what they felt, but they felt the binding let go, and now they're afraid, and the frightened ones move first. He was right. By the 2nd day, the binding's absence had been felt across the whole cluster, not understood but felt, the way you feel a load-bearing wall removed from a house before you consciously notice the ceiling sagging. 11 species who had lived 900 years under a peace they'd stopped being able to feel suddenly felt its absence as a kind of animal dread, and they did what frightened species packed too close together always do. They reached for their weapons, not to attack, at first, to defend. Because if the peace was failing, and something deep in all of them now knew it was, then the neighbor you'd hated for 9 centuries was about to come for you, and you had better come for them first. That's how the long screaming restarted, not with a grand declaration, with fear, with 11 species all reaching for their weapons at the same time, each one telling itself it was only defending, each one's defensive move read by the others as the first blow. The oldest, stupidest engine in the universe, the one my grandmother had spent 51 years holding shut, and it ground back into motion within 48 hours of her death, exactly as she'd always known it would, exactly as her 42 predecessors had spent their lives preventing. The reports started coming in by the 2nd night, and I will carry them for the rest of my life. A Keleth colony world, fired on from orbit by a Vathan fleet that had convinced itself the colony was a staging ground for an attack. It wasn't. It was farmers. 11,000 of them, gone in an afternoon, the first deaths of the new war, people who had been born into the long silence and had never once in their lives imagined the sky could do that. Then a Vathan whirled in answer. Then two more, in a different system, a different pair of ancient enemies, the fire spreading along the old fault lines faster than Soto could mark them on his map. By the third night, his great map of the cluster, the one he'd kept so carefully for 40 years, was so covered in the red marks of new violence that he stopped marking them, because there was no point, because the whole thing was going red. I watched old Soto, who had given his entire life to preventing exactly this, stand in front of that bleeding map, and I watched something break in him that I don't think ever healed. He had the names, you see. 40 years of the cluster's grievances meant 40 years of knowing exactly what each species was capable of, exactly how bad it could get, because he'd studied the long screaming in detail no one else alive possessed. He knew what was coming better than anyone. And he turned to me, this old man who'd spent his life in the quiet service of the peace, and he said, "Your grandmother held this for 51 years, Niamh, every day. And they undid it in two with one bullet because they never understood that the holding was the whole thing." His voice cracked. All that work, all those lives, all those years, one bullet. And the Tellurian Imperium, who had set the whole thing in motion, watched their brilliant plan begin to work, and did not yet understand that it was not working at all. Because here is what the Imperium had expected. They'd expected chaos, yes, a window of confusion in which they, the strong and the prepared, would move in and seize control. What they had not expected was that the chaos would not be a window. It would be a fire, and fire does not politely wait for you to walk through it and claim the building. By the third day, when the Imperium's forces moved to begin their grand seizure of the cluster, they found that the cluster they'd planned to seize no longer existed. In its place was 11 species at war, not in some orderly way the Imperium could exploit, but in the full insane fury of the long screaming, ancient hatreds 9 centuries deep, all igniting at once, every world against its neighbor, a slaughterhouse reopening across a dozen systems faster than anyone could track. The Imperium had wanted to inherit a peaceful cluster. Instead, they'd lit a fire and then walked into it. And now their own worlds, their own borders were catching too, because the Imperium was part of the cluster, and you cannot end the peace for everyone else and remain at peace yourself. The thing they'd broken did not have a handle they could hold. It was just broken for all of them, including the ones who broke it. I've often wondered about the moment the Imperium understood. There must have been a moment in some war room, among the strategists who'd been so proud of their model, the ones who'd studied the Concordance for years and missed the only thing that mattered. There must have been a moment when the reports stopped looking like the controlled chaos they'd planned and started looking like what they actually were, which was the end of everything, the long screaming reborn, ancient hatreds engulfing the Imperium's own worlds along with all the rest. I imagined the silence in that room. I imagined the strategist who'd first proposed the plan, who'd stood up and said the peace is held by one woman. Remove the woman and the cluster is ours. Watching his own homeworld's defense fleet scramble against a neighbor that had hated the Imperium for 900 years and now, with the binding gone, saw its chance. They'd thought they were the predator. They discovered, far too late, that there had been no predator and no prey in the cluster for 9 centuries. There had only been the peace, holding all of them, strong and weak alike, in a quiet that benefited everyone and that none of them had built. The Imperium had been protected by the Concordance exactly as much as their enemies had. And they had killed it, and now the protection was gone for everyone, and the strong empire that had thought itself above the peace was just one more frightened species in a burning cluster, reaching for its weapons like all the rest. The histories say the Imperium tried in those first days to issue declarations, to announce its leadership of the new order, to demand the other species submit to its authority. No one listened. You cannot lead a stampede. The Imperium's grand strategy of conquest dissolved into the same desperate self-defense as everyone else's, and the dream of inheriting the cluster died as quickly and completely as the peace they'd murdered to obtain it. I learned all of this in pieces in that house over that first terrible week, surrounded by the tired people watching their map turn red. And somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped being Niamh who lost her grandmother and started becoming something else, because the others began to look at me. I didn't understand at first. I was 23 years old. I was grieving. I was useless, I thought, just the dead peace-bearer's orphaned granddaughter with no role in any of this. And then Calla, the young one, the one I now realized had been quietly studying for a job we'd all assumed wouldn't come open for decades, sat down beside me on the second night and took my hand, and said the thing that changed my life. "Niamh," she said, "it has to be you." "What has to be me?" "The Concordance." She was crying, but her voice was steady. "The binding is broken, but it can be remade. That's in the founding documents your grandmother showed me years ago. A new peace-bearer can re-anchor it, but it has to be the bloodline. The first peace-bearer built it that way, bound it to her own descendants, because she understood that the cluster would only trust the peace to the family that had already given everything to it for 900 years. The 43rd peace-bearer is dead. The 44th has to take up the binding before the war passes the point of no return, or the Concordance dies with your grandmother and the long screaming runs for another 1,000 years. She gripped my hand harder. "It's you, Niamh. There's no one else of the blood. It was always going to be you. Your grandmother knew. She called you little Keystone." And the whole world rearranged itself around me in that moment. The pet name. The night before, the promise. Hold it instead. She'd been preparing me my whole life in the kitchen, in the things she said while we cooked, and I'd thought it was just love, just an old woman talking, and it had been the most deliberate education in the galaxy. She had known this might come. She had been getting me ready to carry the thing that killed her. "I can't," I said to Calla. It came out as barely a whisper. "I'm 23. I've never done it. I watched her do it my whole life, and I never once did it myself. I don't know how to stand between two species that want to kill each other. I don't know how to find the frightened thing under the angry thing, not the way she could. I'll fail, Calla, and the whole cluster will burn because of me." And Calla, who was crying, who had loved my grandmother too, who was watching her own life's preparation come due in the worst possible way, Calla said the thing I have held onto through every hard day since. She said, "Niamh, none of them knew how when they started. Your grandmother didn't know how when she was 23 and the 42nd peace-bearer died. Not one of the 43 was ready. That's not how it works. You don't take up the peace because you're ready. You take it up because you're the one who's there, and then you learn it by doing it, with the whole cluster watching, with everything on fire, the way every single one of them did. The only qualification that has ever mattered is that you'd rather die holding it than live having let it fall. And I watched you tonight, Niamh. I watched you choose the promise over the revenge when every soul in this house was begging you for blood. You already have the only thing that can't be taught. The rest is just patience with frightened people. She told you. It's the most boring magic in the galaxy, and you've been watching her do it your whole life. I have to start the next part with what it cost, because saying yes was the easy half. I want to tell you about the choice I faced that night, because it was the real climax of everything, more than any battle, and it was not the choice you'd expect. Everyone expected me to want revenge. My own people, half of them, wanted it. The Imperium had murdered Amma, beloved Amma, who'd asked after their families, who'd given 51 years to a peace that kept the Imperium's own world safe. And there was a fury in that house that frightened me, a human fury, the desire to take the Concordance's deep knowledge of the cluster and use it not to make peace but to make the Imperium pay. We could have. That's the thing nobody believes. The peace staff knew the cluster's every weakness, every grievance, every fault line. We could have aimed the long screaming. We could have made very sure that the fire we couldn't stop burned the Imperium down first and worst. There were people in that house, good people, grieving people, who wanted exactly that, and who looked at me, the new peace-bearer of the bloodline, to bless it. And I sat there with my grandmother's blood not yet dry on my clothes and her promise in my ears, "Don't avenge me, hold it instead, especially over my body," and I understood, finally and completely, what she'd been trying to tell me that last night. The Imperium hadn't just expected the chaos. They'd expected our revenge. They were counting on it. A peacekeeping people turning vengeful, aiming the war, choosing a side that would have legitimized everything, would have made the Concordance just another faction in the slaughter, would have proven that the humans were never really peacemakers at all, just another frightened species that picked up a weapon the moment it was wronged. Our revenge was the final piece of the Imperium's plan, the piece that would turn the murder of one woman into the permanent death of the very idea of peace. And I almost gave it to them. I want to be honest about that. Standing in that house, looking at the faces of my grieving people, with the power to aim a war at the empire that killed my grandmother, I wanted it. God help me, I wanted it more than I have ever wanted anything. The promise I'd made felt like a thread against a flood. I need you to understand how close it was, because the histories make me sound certain, and I was not certain. I was 23 and my grandmother was dead, and I had held her while she died, felt the warmth go out of those hands that were always cold anyway, and the being who did it had walked away smiling. Every part of me that was human, that loved her, that had lost her, wanted the Imperium to burn. I could see exactly how to do it. Soto's map was right there. I knew the fault lines. I knew that with a few well-placed truths whispered to the right furious species, I could make certain the Imperium suffered first and worst for what it had done. It would have felt like justice. It would have felt, for one bright, terrible moment, like she hadn't died for nothing. That was the trap. That was always the trap. I could feel my grandmother's voice in me that last night. That is exactly what the breaking is for. The Imperium hadn't only expected our revenge, they needed it. Without it, they were just murderers who had destroyed the thing that protected them, fools who had burned down their own house. But with it, with the Concordance turning vengeful, picking up the war, aiming it, they became something else. They became right. They became the species that had correctly seen the humans were never peacemakers, just weaklings biding their time, who turned killer the instant they were wronged. Our revenge would not have been justice. It would have been the Imperium's alibi, written in the blood of a war we'd chosen to join. It would have killed the very idea of the Concordance far more completely than any bullet, because it would have proven the idea was always a lie. My grandmother had seen all of that, in the simple wisdom of someone who'd spent 51 years watching frightened people destroy themselves. She'd known that the deepest blow you can strike against a peacemaker is not to kill them. It's to make their heirs into avengers. And she had reached forward from that last night on the edge of my bed to stop me from striking it for them. But I'd made it. And she'd known I would want to break it, and she'd made me promise anyway, especially over my body, and I understood that the promise was the whole inheritance. Not the title, not the binding, the promise. The refusal to let them turn our grief into their justification. That was the thing 43 peace-bearers had really carried, not the peace itself, but the discipline to keep choosing it even when every cell in your body screamed for the war. So I held the promise, barely, with my hands shaking and my heart screaming. I held it. So I stood up, in that house full of grief and fury, and I made my choice, and it was the hardest thing I have ever done. And it was the only thing my grandmother had ever really asked of me. "We're not going to avenge her," I said, my voice shook. "We're going to do something so much harder. We're going to put it back." But I'm getting ahead of myself, because saying it was one thing and doing it was another, and what it actually took to put a shattered 900-year peace back together. With the cluster already burning, with the Imperium hunting the bloodline to finish what they'd started, with a 23-year-old who'd never diffused a single crisis in her life now carrying the whole impossible weight. That's the rest of the story. Let me tell you how a girl who'd only ever watched her grandmother hold the piece had to learn, in the middle of a reignited war, with everyone hunting her, to hold it herself, and the terrible price the binding asked of the one who takes it up. Because the Concordance, it turned out, did not bind itself to the bloodline for free. The binding does not bind itself to you for free. That's the thing my grandmother never told me, the one secret she kept, and I understand now why she kept it. She kept it because if I'd known the price in advance, I might have hesitated, and a peace bearer cannot hesitate, and the kindest thing she could do was let me find out only when it was already too late to turn back. Calla took me down into the oldest part of the Concordance house, below the archives, to a room I'd never seen in all my years growing up there. It was small and bare and very old, older than the house around it, and in the center of it was a thing I can only describe as an anchor, a device, or maybe something more than a device, that the first peace bearer had made 900 years ago to hold the binding. It was the physical heart of the Concordance, the thing the piece was actually tied to, and it had been waiting in that room for 9 centuries, passing its connection from bearer to bearer down the bloodline, and now it was dark, because the one it had been bound to was dead. To take it up, Calla said quietly, you have to give it something. The first peace bearer designed it that way on purpose. The binding can't be cheap, or it would be seized by anyone hungry enough. So it asks a price that only someone who truly means it would ever pay. She looked at me with terrible gentleness. It takes your years, Niamh. The binding burns the bearer's own lifespan to hold the peace. That's why they all died old before their time. Your grandmother wasn't old from stress. She was old because the Concordance had been eating her life for 51 years to keep 11 species from each other's throats. Every day she held the peace, it took a piece of her. That's the real cost. That's what no one in the cluster ever knew. The peace they took for granted was being paid for, one human lifespan at a time, by the people they trusted to carry it. I understood then everything about my grandmother, the exhaustion that was bone deep and never lifted. The way she aged faster than the years should have allowed. The cold hands. She had been burning, slowly, my whole life, feeding herself into the thing that kept the cluster quiet, and she'd done it for 51 years without complaint, and she'd never let me see the fire because she didn't want me to fear the thing she hoped I'd one day carry. And now the cluster was burning the way it would always burn without a bearer, and the only way to stop it was to put my own hand on the anchor and let it start eating me too. I want to tell you that I was brave about it. I wasn't. I was terrified. 23 years old, with my whole life in front of me, and the choice was to spend that life, literally spend it, burn it down to hold a peace for species who would never know my name or my cost any more than they'd known my grandmother's. I stood in that old room with my hand hovering over the dark anchor, and every selfish, living, human part of me screamed to walk away, to let someone else carry it, to keep my own years for myself. And then I thought about the Keleth farmers. 11,000 of them, gone in an afternoon, the first of how many. I thought about Soto's map turning red. I thought about my grandmother sitting in the crossfire on Hethron's Reach, because a body in the crossfire is the oldest peace offering there is. And I thought about her cold hands, and the promise, and little Keystone, and I understood that she had never been asking me to avenge her or even to be brave. She'd been asking me to do the one human thing that her whole life had been about, to look at a fire that would consume thousands of strangers, and decide that my own years were a price worth paying to put it out. I put my hand on the anchor, and it took me. I'm not going to describe what that felt like, because there are no words in any language for the moment a thing begins to eat your life, and because it doesn't matter. What matters is what came after. The binding caught. The Concordance, dark since the market, woke again, anchored now to me, to the 44th peace bearer, and across the burning cluster every species felt it, felt the binding reassert itself, the way they'd felt it let go, that animal sense of a load-bearing wall sliding back into place. It didn't stop the war. I want to be clear about that because the histories make it sound like a miracle, and it wasn't. The fires that were already burning kept burning. But the binding's return meant the war could be fought back, that there was once again a center the peace could be rebuilt around, a heartbeat for the 11 species to find their way back to. And then I had to do the impossible thing. I had to do what my grandmother had done for 51 years, except I had to do it in the middle of a war that was already raging, with no peace to maintain but only a peace to rebuild from ashes, and with the Tellurian Imperium hunting me specifically, because they'd finally understood that the bloodline could re-anchor the Concordance, and that as long as a peace-bearer lived, their plan would keep failing. The next 2 years were the hardest of my life, and I won't tell you all of it because most of it was just the boring magic, repeated 10,000 times. Flying toward the sparks, sitting in the crossfire, finding the frightened thing under the angry thing. 2 ancient enemies at a time, world by world, grievance by grievance, doing over again, in the worst conditions imaginable, the patient work that 900 years of peace-bearers had done before me. I was bad at it at first. I made mistakes. People died because of my mistakes, and I carry their names now the way my grandmother carried hers, and I understand at last why she slept so badly. But I got better because you get better at the thing you refuse to stop doing, and slowly, world by world, the fires began to go out. I'll tell you about the first one, though, because I have to. Because it's the moment I stopped being a frightened girl pretending to be a peace-bearer and started actually being one. It was a world called Tannic, a Keleth world that a Vathan fleet had surrounded, both of them an hour from a slaughter that would have killed 100,000 people. And I flew there, alone, in a small unarmed ship, with my grandmother's anchor eating my years and my grandmother's words in my head, and I had never done this, not once, not by myself, and I was so frightened I could barely make my hands work the controls. And then I landed, and I walked into the room where the 2 commanders faced each other, and I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was the thing I'd watched her do on Hethron's Reach when I was 14. I sat down between them, in the most dangerous spot in the room, the spot a stray shot from either side would find first. And I put myself there on purpose, a small frightened human between 2 ancient enemies, and I started asking questions. Quiet ones, not about the standoff, about them. The Keleth commander's homeworld, the Vathan captain's crew, whether any had been hurt, whether she'd wanted this or felt she had no choice. I found the frightened thing under each angry thing. They were so frightened, both of them, exactly as my grandmother always said, frightened of each other, frightened of the war coming back, frightened most of all that the peace was truly gone and there was nothing left but the screaming. And I sat with that fear, and I would not leave, and I told them the binding had been re-anchored, that the Concordance lived, that the peace could still be chosen. And slowly, over a day and a night, the room stopped vibrating. The fleet stood down. 100,000 people on Tannic lived who would have died, and almost none of them ever knew how close it had come, or that a 23-year-old woman burning her own life had sat in the crossfire to save them. On the flight home, I shook for an hour, and then I wept, and then I slept the dead sleep I'd watched my grandmother sleep after Hethron's Reach. And when I woke, I understood that I could do this. Not well, not the way she had, but I could do it. The boring magic worked even in my clumsy hands because it had never been magic at all. It had only ever been a person who refused to leave. The Imperium hunted me the whole time. 3 times they came close. Once they nearly had me on a world called Severin, and I was saved by a Vathan commander. A Vathan, one of the species my grandmother had spent her life keeping the Imperium from, who put his own body between me and the Imperium's killers, because he had finally understood, as the whole cluster was coming to understand, what the peace-bearer actually was and what her death had cost them all. That was the turning. When the species who had hated each other for 900 years began to protect the human who stood between them, rather than letting the Imperium pick her off, the war began to lose. Because the war runs on the belief that your neighbor is your enemy, and a Vathan commander dying to save a human peacemaker from a shared threat is the exact opposite of that belief, and beliefs are what wars are actually made of. His name was Threvar, the Vathan commander. He did die on Severin, not that day. He survived getting me out, but later in the long work of the rebuilding, holding a line so that I could reach a negotiation in time. I went to his people afterward, to his clan, to tell them what he'd done and what it had meant, and I found there the thing that finally convinced me the peace would hold, because his clan did not want vengeance for him either. They had learned, watching him, what my grandmother had spent her life teaching. They wanted what he died for. They wanted the peace. A Vathan war clan, one of the proudest and most violent peoples in the cluster, choosing to honor their dead son by finishing his peace instead of avenging his death. That was the moment I knew we had won, not the war, but the thing under the war, the belief the war is made of. The cluster was learning, at last and at terrible cost, the lesson humanity had carried for 900 years, that the strong are not the ones who avenge. The strong are the ones who refuse to let grief become the next war. The Imperium lost, not the way they feared, not in fire, not in vengeance, not in a great human counterstrike that proved them right about us. They lost the way the breakers of peace deserve to lose, which is by being slowly, completely abandoned. As the cluster understood what had happened, what the Imperium had done and what it had cost, the other 10 species turned away from them. Not in war, in something worse, for a people who dreamed of ruling the cluster in refusal. The Imperium found itself alone, isolated, a pariah, the species that had murdered the peace and got nothing for it but the contempt of everyone they'd hoped to rule. We did not destroy them. I held the promise to the end. We simply rebuilt the peace around them without them, until they were a small bitter thing on the edge of a cluster that had remembered, at terrible cost, why it had chosen quiet in the first place. It took 9 years to rebuild what one bullet broke in an afternoon. 9 years of me flying toward every spark, burning my own life into the anchor a little more each day, until the long silence had been restitched across the cluster, and the war was over and the peace held again, anchored to a peace-bearer who was no longer 23, who had cold hands now, who was tired in the bone-deep way I'd watched my grandmother be tired my whole childhood. I'm not old yet, but I will be before my years. I can feel the binding eating them the way it ate hers. And when I am old before my time, and the cluster has forgotten again how much its quiet costs, there is a child I am teaching to cook, my own grandchild, a little keystone, who watches me come home gray with exhaustion and asks me why, and to whom I say the things my grandmother said to me, planting the education that I hope will never be needed and am preparing anyway, because that is what we do, the bearers of the peace. We carry it until it eats us, and we teach the next one to carry it after, and we never, ever let the breaking turn us into the thing that broke us. The Imperium thought killing one woman would be easy, and it was. That was always the terrible truth at the heart of it. One old woman in a market is the easiest thing in the world to kill. What they never understood is that she was never the peace. None of us are. The peace was never one woman or one anchor or one bloodline. The peace was the choice. The choice my grandmother made every morning for 51 years. The choice I made with my hand on the anchor. The choice to keep finding the frightened thing under the angry thing and sitting with it until it cooled, for strangers forever, at the cost of our own lives, and to refuse, no matter what is done to us, to pick up the war. You can kill the woman who carries the choice. You cannot kill the choice. As long as one human is willing to burn their own years rather than let the cluster scream, the peace will come back, every time, anchored to whoever is left who is willing to pay for it. They killed my grandmother to end 900 years of peace. And the peace held, not because we were strong, but because we were willing to lose everything except the one thing they were trying to take. We never gave them our grief, and that, in the end, is the only war humanity has ever truly won.